MI6 never saw it coming because the spy was looking them in the eye. Kim Philby didn't work against British intelligence. He worked inside it. Deputy Chief of the Secret Service, the second most powerful man in MI6, and he was passing everything to Moscow. For 30 years, walking past the same guards, sitting in the same briefings, reading the same files. The mole wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was sitting at the head of the table. Rewind to 1977. Autumn fog over London, the kind that swallows street corners whole. A former CIA liaison officer stationed in Britain would later admit something remarkable. We assumed the British knew their own people, when that assumption cost the entire Western signals intelligence network a decade of advantage. This is the story of how Moscow planted a ghost inside Britain's most secure facility, and how that ghost remained invisible not despite British competence, but because of it. October 1977, Cheltenham, Gloucestershire. Temperature hovering at 4 degrees Celsius, visibility reduced to 30 meters by the particular gray murk that settles over the Cotswolds in early autumn. A man in an unremarkable wool overcoat approaches the main gate of Government Communications headquarters. He carries a battered leather briefcase, the kind issued to mid-level civil servants across Whitehall. His shoes are polished but not expensive. His face registers nothing, not anxiety, not calculation, not the faintest tremor of a man who has spent the previous evening photographing documents that will reach Moscow within 72 hours. Jeffrey Prime presents his identification badge. The guard nods. The barrier rises. This interaction repeated itself approximately 4,000 times across Prime's GCHQ career, and not once did a security officer detect anything unusual about the linguist who processed Soviet military communications in the facility's most restricted section. The electromagnetic shielding embedded in the building's walls cost more than Prime would earn in 3 lifetimes. The pressure sensors beneath the corridor floors could detect unauthorized movement within millimeters. None of it mattered. The security apparatus was designed to defeat technology, listening devices, transmission equipment, the invisible warfare of signals intelligence. What it could not defeat was a man who carried secrets out in his memory and transferred them using methods perfected before the invention of radar. Prime had been passing classified material to Soviet handlers for 9 years by that October morning. He would continue for 5 more. The total volume of compromised intelligence remains partially classified even now, 4 decades later, though internal assessments suggest the damage exceeded any single penetration in GCHQ history. The guards who waved him through were not incompetent. They followed procedures exactly as written, checked credentials precisely as trained. Their failure was not operational, but philosophical. They had been taught to look for threats that announced themselves through technical signatures. Jeffrey Prime announced nothing. He simply walked and walked and walked again, until the morning his quiet life attracted attention for reasons entirely unrelated to espionage. To understand how a nondescript British linguist became Moscow's most valuable Western asset, we must return to Berlin, 1956. The divided city that wound in the center of Europe where ideological surgery had separated families, neighborhoods, and futures with concrete and barbed wire. Western intelligence agencies operated under a dangerous assumption that Soviet recruitment methods were crude, relying on ideological true believers or compromised individuals caught in honey traps and blackmail schemes. The reality was fundamentally different. The KGB's second chief directorate had developed psychological profiling techniques that would not appear in Western academic literature for another 2 decades. Their targets were not the obvious candidates, not the Cambridge-educated idealists, not the financially desperate, not the sexually vulnerable. Those profiles attracted counterintelligence attention precisely because they matched expected patterns. Moscow wanted something subtler: individuals with technical access, emotional isolation, and the particular kind of resentment that never announces itself through outward complaint. Jeffrey Prime fit this profile with uncomfortable precision. Raised in working-class circumstances, intellectually gifted but socially awkward, possessed of exceptional linguistic ability that earned professional respect but never personal warmth. Now, he had joined the Royal Air Force in 1956, the same year the KGB began systematically cataloging personality types among Western military linguists stationed in Germany. The recruitment itself, when it came in 1968, was almost anticlimactic. Prime walked into an East German checkpoint during a posting to Berlin and offered his services. No dramatic approach, no gradual seduction, no crisis of conscience exploited by patient handlers. He had made the decision alone, in the privacy of his own dissatisfaction, and presented himself like a man who had been waiting for the opportunity his entire adult life. The KGB file created that evening would eventually span hundreds of pages, but the initial psychological assessment captured something essential. Here was a man invisible to his own colleagues, whose competence guaranteed access while his personality guaranteed anonymity. Britain's greatest intelligence threat wore a British uniform, spoke with a British accent, and harbored grievances so quiet that no security interview would ever surface them. Cheltenham sits 50 miles from London, deliberately chosen for its distance from obvious targets and its anonymity among the gentle hills of Gloucestershire. The headquarters of Government Communications Headquarters, Britain's signals intelligence nerve center, occupies a campus that most locals drove past without a second glance, its purpose officially unacknowledged until 1983. The security architecture represented everything British engineering could achieve in the defense of secrets. Electromagnetic shielding embedded in every wall prevented any signal from escaping the building's perimeter. Faraday caging around sensitive areas created zones of absolute electronic silence. The document vaults operated under positive pressure, ensuring air flowed outward through any breach, rather than allowing contaminants or listening devices to enter. Staff with access to the highest classifications passed through separate entrances, their movements logged by systems that could reconstruct any individual's location throughout the workday. Clearance protocols followed a tiered structure inherited from wartime practices and refined through decades of Cold War paranoia. Developed vetting, the most intensive level, required investigators to interview family members, neighbors, former colleagues, anyone who might reveal character flaws or foreign connections. The process consumed months and cost thousands of pounds per candidate. Jeffrey Prime passed every level. He received access to SIGINT operations targeting Soviet military communications, meaning he knew not only what Britain intercepted, but how the interception occurred. Frequencies monitored, techniques employed, vulnerabilities exploited. The damage potential was almost incalculable, and yet the systems designed to prevent exactly this failure detected nothing. The architecture assumed that threats would manifest through technology, hidden transmitters, unauthorized copying equipment, electronic dead drops. Prime used none of these methods. His tools were a camera small enough to conceal in a pocket, photographic memory trained through years of linguistic work, and the patience to transfer information in fragments so small that no single incident would trigger automated alerts. The fortress had been built to repel machines. It had not been built to repel a man who understood that the oldest methods remain effective precisely because modern defenses have forgotten them. The Americans, by the 1970s, had embraced the polygraph with something approaching religious devotion. Every intelligence officer, every analyst with clearance, every contractor touching classified material faced the machine's judgment. Electrodes measuring galvanic skin response, pneumograph tubes tracking respiration, cardiovascular monitors searching for the physiological signatures of deception. The British regarded this practice with barely concealed disdain. Polygraph interrogation, in the view of Whitehall's intelligence establishment, represented a crude American solution to a problem that proper vetting should prevent from arising. If one selected candidates from appropriate backgrounds, verified their associations through thorough investigation, and trusted the judgment of experienced officers who could read character in a handshake and an interview, then mechanical lie detection became not merely unnecessary, but vaguely insulting. Gentlemen did not deceive, and gentlemen could recognize other gentlemen. Geoffrey Prime was not a gentleman by any traditional metric. He lacked the educational pedigree, the social connections, the easy confidence that marked the officer class. What he possessed instead was something more valuable to an organization that processed thousands of intercepted Soviet communications daily. Genuine, exceptional competence in Russian language and signals analysis. His colleagues found him quiet, perhaps odd, certainly not someone to invite for drinks after work. But his translations were precise, his analysis acute, and his dedication to long hours of tedious intercept processing unquestionable. In an environment that valued technical excellence, his personality became invisible behind his productivity. No interviewer asked why a man with his abilities seemed content to remain in mid-level positions without seeking advancement. No security review questioned whether his social isolation might indicate vulnerabilities. His quietness read as professionalism. His lack of ambition read as modesty. His emotional distance read as the appropriate demeanor for work that required discretion. The American polygraph, for all its flaws, might have detected something. A spike in response when asked about foreign contacts, perhaps. Or the micro-expressions of a man constructing careful lies. The British system, trusting human judgment over mechanical measurement, saw only what Geoffrey Prime wanted them to see: a competent linguist doing valuable work. The bridge over the River Chelt near Sandford Park became, for 7 years, one of the most productive intelligence transfer points in Soviet espionage history. No surveillance team ever photographed an exchange there. No counterintelligence officer ever noticed the chalk marks that appeared on its stone railing at irregular intervals. A horizontal line meaning material ready for collection. A diagonal slash meaning acknowledge receipt. Prime's tradecraft was deliberately archaic. While Western intelligence agencies poured resources into satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and computer-assisted analysis, he operated according to methods that would have been recognizable to agents of the Okhrana a century earlier. His handlers provided one-time pads for encoding messages, sequences of random numbers used once and destroyed, mathematically unbreakable without the corresponding sheet. They taught him microdot photography, reducing entire pages of classified documents to periods that could be hidden in ordinary correspondence. They established dead drop locations throughout Cheltenham's unremarkable suburban geography. Specific benches, particular trees, exact positions behind loose bricks in walls that joggers passed without a glance. The genius of analog tradecraft lies in its immunity to electronic detection. GCHQ could monitor every radio frequency, intercept every digital transmission, analyze every communication passing through British infrastructure, and none of it would reveal a man walking to a bridge with film concealed in a hollowed book spine. Prime made approximately 15 major transfers between 1968 and 1977, each containing material that Moscow's analysts later described as invaluable in understanding Western signals intelligence capabilities. The locations changed according to predetermined schedules, the timing varied to avoid pattern recognition. The quantities remained small enough that no single loss would trigger investigation. He moved through spaces that thousands of Cheltenham residents used daily: parks where children played, streets where pensioners walked dogs, bridges where couples paused to watch the water. The secrets traveled alongside ordinary life, hidden not by sophisticated technology, but by the simple fact that no one was looking. The most effective camouflage, Prime understood, was normalcy. The most impenetrable encryption was silence, and silence he maintained, until circumstances entirely beyond his control forced speech. Cheltenham, England, the government communications headquarters. A nondescript campus of low buildings where mathematicians and linguists waged invisible war against Soviet cipher systems. Every breakthrough here cost years of computational effort, millions of pounds, the focused genius of Britain's finest analytical minds. Geoffrey Prime walked out with all of it. The declassified damage assessments, released decades later under pressure from parliamentary inquiry, read like an obituary for Western signals intelligence. Prime compromised Operation Ivan, the joint Anglo-American effort to intercept Soviet submarine communications in the North Atlantic. He revealed the frequencies NATO used to track ballistic missile submarines during their patrol cycles. He exposed the technical vulnerabilities in encrypted military communications that GCHQ had spent 15 years learning to exploit. The numbers are staggering in their implications. 43 distinct intelligence operations compromised or terminated. An estimated 500 Soviet and Warsaw Pact personnel identified as potential Western assets, their fates unknown, their silence permanent. Technical collection capabilities valued at over $2 billion in developmental costs, rendered worthless overnight. But the true cost cannot be quantified in currency. During the peak years of Prime's treachery, NATO submarine commanders operated under assumptions that Moscow had already invalidated. Patrol patterns designed to ensure second-strike nuclear capability were known to Soviet naval intelligence before the orders left Allied headquarters. The entire architecture of Western deterrence rested on foundations that one gray man had quietly excavated. A senior NSA analyst would later testify that Prime's intelligence enabled the Soviets to read our underwater chess moves 3 turns ahead. British submariners, American carrier groups, the entire North Atlantic defense network, thousands of servicemen operating in what they believed was strategic ambiguity were actually performing for an audience in Moscow. The Soviets knew where the listening posts were. They knew which frequencies to avoid. They knew the gaps in coverage, the maintenance schedules, the shift rotations. And across the Atlantic, American analysts were beginning to notice that something had gone terribly wrong. Fort Meade, Maryland, 1978. Inside the National Security Agency's Operations Center, a pattern analyst named Charles Talbot noticed anomalies that defied innocent explanation. Soviet naval communications were changing their encryption protocols with suspicious precision. Always just ahead of American collection upgrades, always targeting the exact capabilities that NATO considered most secure. Talbot compiled his findings into a classified memorandum that climbed the bureaucratic ladder with gathering urgency. The conclusion was professionally cautious, but operationally damning. the Soviets appeared to possess advanced knowledge of Anglo-American SIGINT capabilities. The leak, his analysis suggested, originated somewhere within the GCHQ partnership. The American warning arrived in London wrapped in diplomatic language but carrying unmistakable accusation. The British response was institutional ice. Senior officials at GCHQ dismissed the American concerns as analytical overreach, the inevitable paranoia of an intelligence community still wounded by its own mole hunts. The Philby affair had been a British embarrassment. Surely the Americans would enjoy discovering another. Internal memoranda from this period reveal a fortress mentality. The suggestion that GCHQ harbored a Soviet penetration was treated less as a security concern than as a diplomatic insult. The transatlantic friction that followed would define Cold War intelligence relations for years. American liaison officers found their British counterparts polite but unreceptive, cooperative in letter but resistant in spirit. Compartmentalization increased, not against Soviet penetration, but against American scrutiny. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Prime continued his daily commute. He sat in meetings where American concerns were discussed and dismissed. He processed the very signals intelligence that analysts at Fort Meade were watching disappear into Soviet countermeasures. The institutional defensiveness that shielded GCHQ's reputation also shielded the man who was destroying it from within. This was the tragic architecture of the Prime case. Warnings that arrived, were evaluated, and were discarded by the very institution they sought to protect. Not through conspiracy or corruption, but through the simpler sin of pride. How long can institutional reputation survive when its greatest defender is its greatest threat? To understand the scope of Prime's treachery, one must trace his ascent through the hierarchy of British signals intelligence like mapping the spread of an undetected cancer. 1968, junior linguist with basic clearances, accessing peripheral Soviet communications. His handlers in Moscow received transcripts of intercepted radio traffic, useful but unremarkable intelligence that any competent agent might provide. 1972, promoted to analyst status, now reading finished intelligence products that synthesized multiple collection streams. The Soviets began receiving not just raw intercepts, but British assessments of what those intercepts meant. 1975, senior analyst position at Cheltenham, with access to compartmented programs targeting Soviet strategic communications. Prime's reports to Moscow now included technical specifications for collection equipment, targeting priorities, and the identities of linguists specializing in specific Soviet military formations. 1978. At the apex of his access, Prime processed intelligence from the most sensitive Anglo-American joint programs, when nothing in the North Atlantic collection architecture remained hidden from his quiet eyes. His performance reviews from this period survive in declassified files, and they tell a story of magnificent camouflage. Competent but unexceptional. Reliable worker, limited initiative. Suitable for continued employment at current grade. The bureaucratic language of mediocrity became his perfect cover. Supervisors saw a gray man doing gray work, never suspecting that his apparent limitations concealed operational discipline. The Soviets, by contrast, recognized genius. KGB communications intercepted years later revealed their assessment of Prime as our most productive technical source in the British establishment. While his British superiors marked him as unremarkable, his Soviet controllers considered him irreplaceable. Through 15 years of parallel evaluations running in opposite directions, and not once did the disparity surface for examination. The mathematics of undetected treachery compound across time. Each year of continued access multiplied the damage exponentially. not merely adding to the intelligence hemorrhage, but validating Soviet assumptions about Western collection that shaped their own operational security for decades. By the time Jeffrey Prime finally fell, his handlers had long since promoted him beyond anything Cheltenham would ever recognize. MI5 maintained dedicated counterintelligence sections. GCHQ employed security officers trained specifically to detect insider threats. The entire apparatus of British state security existed to identify precisely the kind of penetration that Jeffrey Prime represented. A village constable accomplished what all of them could not. April 1982. Herefordshire police received complaints about a man approaching young girls near schools. Detective Sergeant David Cole, working what he considered routine investigative work, traced the descriptions to a quiet residence in the village of Pitchcroft. The suspect was a recently divorced telecommunications worker named Jeffrey Prime. Cole obtained a search warrant for evidence related to the sexual offenses. What his officers found instead would trigger the largest counterintelligence investigation since the exposure of the Cambridge Five. Hidden in Prime's home were one-time cipher pads identical to those used by Soviet intelligence. Miniature cameras designed for document photography. Detailed notes on GCHQ security procedures written in Prime's careful hand. And a shortwave radio preset to frequencies known to carry KGB communications. The village constable had stumbled into the most damaging Soviet penetration of British intelligence in Cold War history. Cole immediately contacted Special Branch, who contacted MI5, who contacted the Security Service's Soviet specialists. Within hours, the investigation transformed from local police work into a national security emergency. But the essential fact remained. Random chance and mundane criminality had exposed what 15 years of professional counterintelligence had missed entirely. Parliamentary inquiries would later describe this as a damning indictment of institutional complacency. The Security Commission's classified report used sharper language, calling it an intelligence failure of the first magnitude, to be redeemed only by fortune. Prime's arrest on sexual offense charges preceded his espionage interrogation by 3 days. For those 72 hours, he sat in a Herefordshire jail cell, a grey man finally visible, waiting to discover whether police had understood what they had found among his possessions. When MI5 interrogators finally arrived, they carried questions that had been accumulating, unasked, for 3 decades. The transcript runs to 400 pages. Seated in a windowless room at Paddington Green Police Station, Jeffrey Prime faced interrogators who had spent years studying Soviet recruitment methodology without ever encountering its product in the flesh. What they found defied their operational assumptions. Prime did not resist. He did not negotiate. He confessed with the methodical precision of a man filing quarterly reports, offering details that his interrogators had not thought to request. I photographed approximately 500 documents during my final year at Cheltenham, he stated during the 3rd session. The Soviets provided equipment that could capture 40 pages per minute. I worked efficiently. His psychological profile emerged through these sessions with disturbing clarity. Prime displayed no ideological conviction, no grand narrative of communist sympathy or anti-Western grievance. When asked why he had betrayed his country, his answer carried the flatness of genuine bewilderment at the question. They approached me. They asked. I had access. It seemed straightforward. Soviet recruitment doctrine, interrogators would later note, and I specifically targeted individuals exhibiting Prime's psychological markers, social isolation, suppressed resentment toward institutional authority, and a profound sense of personal invisibility. The KGB had identified him not as a believer, but as a vacuum, someone who would accept external purpose because he possessed none of his own. The interrogations revealed something more troubling than individual pathology. Prime's success depended entirely on institutional blindness. The assumption that unremarkable employees posed unremarkable risks. His gray existence had been his operational cover. His mediocre performance reviews his security clearance renewal. When asked whether he believed others like him remained within British intelligence, Prime offered the only moment of apparent emotion in the entire transcript. I wouldn't know, he said. We weren't the type to stand out. The question lingered in that room long after Prime departed for his 42-year sentence, hanging in the stale air like a diagnostic the system could not bring itself to run. How many other gray men still walked those corridors, invisible and waiting? September 1982. A secure conference room beneath Whitehall. The men assembled around the table have collectively served British intelligence for over 2 centuries, yet none of them want to be here. The document before them carries no title, only a classification so restricted that its very existence would remain denied for decades. What the analysts have compiled represents the most comprehensive autopsy of a single human being's destructive potential ever assembled by British intelligence. The findings are staggering in their geographic scope. Operations compromised across Western Europe. Assets burned in Eastern Bloc countries who would never report again because they were already dead. Communications intercepts that Moscow had been reading in real time, while GCHQ congratulated itself on cryptographic superiority. The damage spread across 3 continents, like a slow-moving hemorrhage that British intelligence had never felt, because Prime had applied the tourniquet himself, selectively, strategically, invisibly. One section of the assessment details Operation Choir, a signals intelligence initiative targeting Soviet submarine communications in the North Atlantic. The Soviets had mysteriously altered their transmission protocols at the precise moment the operation achieved viability. Coincidence? And the assessment labels it probable compromise. 17 such incidents receive similar designation, but the most sensitive pages address Allied operations. American surveillance flights whose routes Prime had access to. NATO early warning procedures he could have described in his sleep. Australian listening posts whose existence Britain had confirmed to its intelligence partners, and whose security now required complete reassessment. The debate that follows focuses not on remediation, but on disclosure. How much do we tell the Americans? The answer, reached after considerable argument, prioritizes institutional reputation over Allied transparency. The assessment would be summarized, sanitized, softened around its most damaging edges before transmission to Langley and Fort Meade. Which British leadership understood something their American counterparts would soon discover independently. Some truths are too expensive to share, even among friends. The Americans would not remain ignorant for long. Fort Meade, Maryland. The National Security Agency's headquarters buzzes with activity that autumn, but the conversation in Deputy Director's suite concerns events 3,000 miles away. The Americans have conducted their own assessment, and their conclusions make the sanitized British version look like optimistic fiction. Declassified cables from October 1982 reveal the institutional fury that Prime's betrayal ignited across the Atlantic. One NSA memorandum, released 30 years later under FOIA, now describes British security procedures as demonstrably inadequate to the threat environment, and recommends immediate restrictions on intelligence sharing with GCHQ pending comprehensive reform of positive vetting protocols. Congressional testimony delivered in closed session before the Senate Intelligence Committee, proves even more damning. The transcript, partially declassified in 2013, shows American intelligence officials questioning whether British penetration might extend beyond a single compromised analyst, whether Prime represented a symptom rather than an isolated case. The institutional ramifications would reshape transatlantic intelligence cooperation for a generation. New compartmentalization procedures emerged from the Prime case. Information shared with British partners would now carry additional handling restrictions. Certain categories of signals intelligence would require explicit American approval before British analysts could access them. The special relationship in intelligence matters acquired new asterisks and footnotes. Within the halls of GCHQ, the American verdict stung worse than any public embarrassment. These were the professionals whose respect mattered most, the cousins with whom British signals intelligence had collaborated since World War II. Their formal criticism carried the weight of family disappointment rather than foreign condemnation. The irony was not lost on those who understood the case's full dimensions. American intelligence agencies had suffered their own penetrations, cases that would emerge in subsequent decades with equally devastating consequences. But in 1982, now the British had provided a convenient lesson in institutional failure that their American counterparts would study and cite for years. Prime had not merely betrayed his country, he had diminished Britain's standing within the Western intelligence community at the precise moment when Cold War tensions demanded maximum cooperation. What the vetting system had missed would haunt both nations. The positive vetting system of the Cold War era operated on a fundamental assumption that biography predicts behavior. Investigators examined education, employment history, family connections, financial records, associates and acquaintances. They interviewed neighbors, former colleagues, distant relatives. The process consumed months and generated files inches thick with documented facts about a subject's past. The system had been designed in response to earlier penetrations. Philby, Burgess, McLean. Upper-class traders whose privileged backgrounds and establishment connections had shielded them from suspicion. Positive vetting represented the institutional answer. Verify everything. Trust nothing. Document the complete life story before granting access to secrets. Against Jeffrey Prime, the system failed catastrophically because it was designed to catch the wrong kind of spy. Prime's biography was unremarkable. Working-class origins, RAF service, competent linguist, no Cambridge connections, no ideological circles, no suspicious foreign contacts that predated his recruitment. The vetting process found exactly what it expected to find: an ordinary man with an ordinary history. What the system could not detect was the psychological architecture that made Prime uniquely vulnerable to Soviet recruitment. The internal conflicts, the compulsive behaviors, the compartmentalized mind that could hold contradictory loyalties without apparent stress. These were not biographical facts, but psychological realities that no background investigation could surface. The Soviets understood this better than British intelligence. Their recruitment methodology targeted psychological profiles rather than political ideologies. They sought individuals whose internal contradictions created exploitable vulnerabilities, people who could be approached, developed, and controlled through careful manipulation of their psychological needs. Counterintelligence professionals who studied the case afterward reached uncomfortable conclusions. No amount of background investigation would have identified Prime as a potential traitor before his recruitment. The system was searching for ideological motivation while the Soviets were recruiting psychological susceptibility. The reforms that followed, enhanced psychological screening, continuous monitoring, behavioral analysis, arrived decades after they might have mattered. Institutional learning, when it finally occurred, came at the cost of 38 lost years and countless compromised operations. Some lessons require the highest possible tuition. Wormwood Scrubs, West London, a Victorian prison whose very name carries the weight of British penal history. Geoffrey Prime entered these walls in November 1982, sentenced to 38 years, 35 for espionage, and 3 for the offenses against children that had ultimately exposed him. The sentence represented the longest ever imposed for espionage in British legal history. The man who had handled some of the most sensitive signals intelligence of the Cold War would spend the next decades in conditions designed for Victorian criminals. Cell blocks built in the 1870s. Exercise yards measured in paces rather than acres. A routine defined by mealtimes, head counts, and the slow erosion of years. British justice had spoken with unusual severity. The sentence reflected not merely the crimes themselves, but the strategic calculus of damage that Prime's betrayal represented. Prosecutors had argued, successfully, that the duration of his espionage, over a decade of active service to Moscow, demanded punishment commensurate with the sustained nature of the treachery. Yet questions lingered in the aftermath. What punishment could truly balance the ledger that Prime's activities had created? The assets compromised. The operations burned. The intelligence advantage surrendered to an adversary. The diminished standing among Allied services. The institutional reforms forced upon British intelligence. These consequences extended far beyond any individual's capacity to experience proportional suffering. Prime served his time with characteristic opacity. Prison officials who encountered him over the years reported a man who neither complained nor confessed, who maintained the same emotional containment that had served him throughout his double life. The compartmentalization that had enabled his espionage apparently functioned equally well behind bars. He was released in 2001, having served 19 years, roughly half his sentence, standard for British prisoners who present no disciplinary problems. The man who emerged was 73 years old, a relic of a Cold War that had ended while he sat in his cell, his Soviet handlers long since scattered or dead, his secrets decades out of date. The walls had contained the man. Nothing could contain what he had already given away. The corridors of GCHQ's new donut-shaped headquarters in Cheltenham gleam with technological sophistication unimaginable in Prime's era. Biometric scanners guard every portal. Behavioral analytics monitor digital footprints. Artificial intelligence flags anomalous patterns in real time. The architecture itself represents billions of pounds invested in the proposition that technology can prevent human betrayal. And yet, the fundamental lesson of Geoffrey Prime's case resists technological solution because it addresses something no algorithm can assess: the human capacity for concealment. Prime did not defeat British security through technical sophistication or elaborate tradecraft. He defeated it by being unremarkable, by presenting exactly the face that his environment expected to see, by exploiting the gap between institutional assumptions and individual reality. Every modern counterintelligence professional understands this truth, even as they deploy ever more sophisticated detection systems. The insider threat cannot be eliminated through technology because the insider begins as a trusted colleague, passes through the same checkpoints, attends the same briefings, drinks tea in the same break rooms. The threat wears the same badge, speaks the same institutional language, participates in the same organizational culture. How many current threats walk past familiar checkpoints with familiar faces? This is the permanent uncertainty that Prime's case created, the knowledge that human intelligence failures operate on a different timeline than technological ones. A compromised encryption system can be replaced. A penetrated agent can be identified and neutralized. But an insider who has not yet decided to betray, who carries within him the psychological architecture of potential treachery without having yet activated it. This threat exists in a quantum state that no vetting procedure can collapse into certainty. The ghost of Jeffrey Prime walks the corridors of every Western intelligence agency not as a specific threat, but as an enduring possibility. Somewhere in those gleaming buildings, at those classified workstations, behind those biometric barriers, sits an individual whose internal contradictions have not yet been exploited, whose recruitment has not yet occurred, whose betrayal remains theoretical. The technology advances. The scanners multiply, the algorithms improve. The human question remains unanswered. Jeffrey Prime's 30-year deception exposed something no security apparatus has yet solved: the irreducible vulnerability of trusting human beings with secrets. If this examination of Cold War's most damaging mole revealed dimensions you hadn't considered, the subscription button ensures you won't miss our next investigation. We're examining an operation where 8 men crossed 200 miles of enemy territory with nothing but compasses and courage. The patrol that proved technology fails precisely when soldiers need it most.